Hey, so in this video I'm going to take you through Microthemer's preferences. So to access these, we go to the settings, make sure that the general tab is open, and then click on preferences. And we've got a few tabs, so let's start with the general tab here. So the first set of preferences just relate to CSS and Sass. So the first option is about whether or not to enable global use of important on the CSS styles. So if I just go to another tab, if we, I'm just going to set a random setting here. If we've got the important enabled by default globally, then whenever we add any kind of CSS rule, it will be added automatically. And that's just to help beginners that haven't learned about the rules of CSS specificity, and they're customizing their theme, and they just want to make sure that the styles they add in Microthemer override the theme without looking into like whether they've used IDs and it's got a high enough specificity score and all that kind of stuff. So it just allows them to defer that learning to a little bit further down the line. And when you've got it disabled, you'll see this option here where you can, if you want to, you can enable important on a particular field. So this won't be displayed if important is enabled, of course, globally. Okay, so the next option is about enabling Sass. This isn't enabled by default, I've just enabled it here in the video so I can show you what it does. So with Sass support enabled, let's go back here. Let's say we had set, to set global variables via the full code editor. So here I've just set background color yellow. And by the way, there's a keyboard shortcut for switching these views. It's Control-Alt-C. So I can go back to this view. And then if I apply this setting here for background color, then my variable I've set before will take effect here on the page. So over here we've got the option just to minify Microthemer's CSS output. That just removes all the white space from the file Microthemer generates and loads. We've got the option to report hex values, report colors in hex values instead of RGBA. So to give you an example of what that means, if I just put this color back actually. So the reported color values are shown if we hover over an icon for a property, and so this is showing the background color as a hex value rather than an RGB value. And the option to set use absolute URLs when setting a background image. Here that just means, so if we were to set, I'm just going to comment this out again actually, if we were to set this background image here, just by setting the logo to repeat here, by default Microthemer tries to uses a relative URL, so relative to the root of the website. But if we were to enable the option here to set absolute, it would include the domain name as well. And that's, most of the time it's better, this is off by default, most of the time it's better to use relative URLs. That just means that when you're, say, moving between a dev site and a live site, the URLs are all, they don't need to be updated again. But there's occasions where if you've installed WordPress in a subfolder and you're working maybe on localhost, the relative paths aren't quite right, so you can use this option to fix that. The option to enable global CSS on the login page, yep, so this is something you can turn on if you want to style the login page. Microthemer's CSS won't load there by default unless you set this to yes. And in terms of the admin shortcut options, let's just have a look here. So the first option is about just when you're on the admin side and whether or not Microthemer should be included in the top menu. And then there's also an option just down below. It could either, if it is included, it can either be the top menu link like we've just seen, or it can be as a sub-menu. So if you've got lots of things in your WordPress toolbar and you don't want things to be too cluttered, you can set this to no. And then in terms of the on the site preview, let's just go back to the Microthemer interface here. That's talking about this bar here. So sometimes this is useful to keep if you just want to, like, say, edit the page, switch between styling the page and editing the actual content, or jump to page builders. But if it's a bit of a distraction, you can use the preference to set that to not display. Now with Google Fonts, there's just an option to load a subset URL. So if you can see the tooltip here, the example is if you want to load the Latin subset or Latin extended when we're calling the Google Fonts file, then you can add that here. The style sheet options, there's one option to load the style sheet in the footer. That's useful if you're using Microthemer to make sort of non-critical CSS changes. So say you're customizing a theme and all of the default theme styling is in place, and you're changing a few things that don't have to be displayed when the page first loads. Ideally, they'd be down below the fold so that content that's only visible once the user scrolls down. Then this can give you a performance boost loading it in the footer. And then style sheet loading order, that's sort of for compatibility with other plugins and themes that might be loading CSS resources that you want to override with Microthemer. And if the Microthemer style sheet loads afterwards, so that you can choose the latest possible option here, then you don't have to, again this goes back to CSS specificity, you don't have to make sure that your selectors have higher specificity than the CSS you're trying to override. They can be equal to it if the style sheet loads after the other CSS that you're trying to override. So this is mainly there for compatibility, fixing compatibility issues that can arise. And then the final option in this section is the prefix for page-specific classes that Microthemer adds. So that's if we go here and say, let's just create a selector for this heading here, and say I wanted to enable the page ID. If we go to the beginning here, it's this prefix here, so MT-2. Now the new default one is actually MTP, and you can see that here in the drop-down list. The new default one is MTP. That's just to fix a compatibility issue with Bootstrap and Tailwind that arose, where MT hyphen and then a number was adding top margin to the body tag. Now we've got some options for the interface. So you can change the URL Microthemer loads. This isn't the only place you can set it. There is a page navigator here where you can change the page. The option in preferences is mainly for troubleshooting purposes. So if you load the front end preview here, not using HTTPS, but the admin area is using HTTPS, so secure SSL, or the reverse, then you'll get some JavaScript warnings that might make the Microthemer interface unresponsive, and so you can set this here by adding an S to the HTTP bit to fix that. So the number of revisions to restore, that relates to this feature here where, let's see, history. Yeah, so this pane here shows the first 10. It'll always show the first 10, but you can go and see a full list of all of your revisions here. And Microthemer will restore 50 by default, but you can set this to up to 300. It just takes a bit more space in the database, but it can be really useful to have more, be able to go back further. Okay, the tape measure slider, yeah, that's basically just relates to, let's see, this slider here. I provided an option because I'm not sure how many people turn that setting on, but here you drag left in order to set a higher number and right in order to set a lower number. And if that feels unintuitive, you can switch it around. So you drag right to increase and left to decrease. Okay. And yeah, gzipping the interface for faster loading. I think this is off by default, but you can enable that just to get an extra speed boost. It's just that it may not be compatible with all servers. So you might want to set this to no. And that's actually partly why we've got, there's actually, hang on, if I go to WordPress, there is a standalone preferences page as well. And so in case this setting here was enabled and caused you problems and you couldn't load the Microthemer interface, it's useful to be able to turn that off here so you can fix things. Okay. So JavaScript section. Okay, yeah. So by default, Microthemer just checks the front end of your site for general JavaScript errors, not necessarily anything to do with Microthemer. That's because any kind of general error, it could be with an analytics plugin or a Facebook widget or something like that. It can sometimes cause problems so that you can't select things, you can't click on things and select them in Microthemer. Microthemer relies on the front end of the site just working in normal working order. So it'll tell you about any errors on your site, and it will do that. Let me just show you. Just at the top right here where all of the notifications are, it'll just tell you there's an error. And that can be really useful for just, in general, just debugging problems that might be occurring on your site because they might be affecting Microthemer negatively or something else on your site negatively. And yeah, so with Microthemer, there's an option to load, to code in JavaScript. Again, let's go to the full code view for that. Let's see, yeah, this tab here. And the setting just determines whether or not that loads in the footer instead of the head of the document. And you can also list some scripts that your JavaScript depends on. So if you're dependent on jQuery or some other script handles, maybe some custom script handles, you can just list these here. And then Microthemer will ensure that your JavaScript loads after those. We've also got a legacy setting that where Microthemer used to add first and last classes to menu items. That's not on by default. It's just there really so that people, if they had it enabled before, they can still turn it off. But I wouldn't expect many people to have to change this setting. And there's a setting here where you can regenerate the CSS and run a repair on Microthemer's data. So Microthemer just checks for any anomalies and runs a fix, which can fix some problems. Over on the Units tab, we've got an option here which you might want to do at the start of installing Microthemer, where you can just choose, if you prefer to work, say, with rems on the whole, you can just set them all to rems. And if we go back I'll just go back to the normal view. So here you see we've got the pixels by default for size, and we can change that by, say, setting, I don't know, 1 rem, and then it will update. But if we globally set all of our length units to rem, then we just don't have to do that. We can just write the number in future. And then obviously you don't have to set them all to the same thing, but you can individually choose your preferences here. The Inactive tab, this is useful if you want to uninstall Microthemer but still load the CSS changes that you've made. You can either copy some code to your theme's functions.php file, which is shown here, or you can download a simple plugin, which is basically just all of this code packaged in the plugin. And that's useful if you're handing the site over to a client and you don't want them to be able to make changes with Microthemer for whatever reason. Oh, and at the top here, this is just, so partly because of this option where you can still load Microthemer's code without actually having it installed. Microthemer, when you uninstall Microthemer, it doesn't by default delete anything. Only if you set this option to yes will it delete everything. So by default, this is set to no. But you'll use this if you're not going to use Microthemer on a site, you just want to do a clean uninstall, set this option to yes, then uninstall it, and everything in the database and the files will be deleted. So compatibility, this may not exist when you come to use it. It's just it was a fix for around WordPress version 5.6, where they changed the version of jQuery, and some people that maybe had themes or other plugins that were reliant on the older version, so they had to stick with the older version to keep things smooth with Microthemer. There was an option to set this to use a legacy version as well. Okay, and I think that covers everything. Thanks for watching.